Family planned my funeral. While I was in a coma, then I woke up during the service. I'm Sarah Chen, and 3 months ago, I experienced something that would fundamentally change everything I thought I knew about the people I called family. Picture this. You're lying in what you think is the deepest sleep of your life, and suddenly you hear your own mother discussing flower arrangements for your funeral service. Not a nightmare, not a dream, reality. My reality, when I woke up during what was supposed to be my final goodbye. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in Portland, Oregon, during what should have been just another routine commute to my job at the nonprofit environmental center downtown. I remember every detail leading up to that moment with crystalline clarity, the way trauma burns certain memories into your consciousness. I had stopped at my usual coffee shop, Grind Coffee on Morrison Street, ordering my standard oat milk latte with an extra shot of espresso. The barista, Marcus, who knew my order by heart after 2 years of identical Tuesday morning visits, handed me the cup with his characteristic smile and reminded me about the new sustainability workshop they were hosting that weekend. I was running, precisely 7 minutes behind my normal schedule, something that would typically send my anxiety spiraling since I prided myself on punctuality. But that morning felt different somehow, lighter. I had just received confirmation the night before that our organization had secured a major grant for the river restoration project I had been developing for 8 months. The excitement of knowing I could finally move forward with plans to clean up the Willamette River's eastern tributaries made even Portland's notorious morning drizzle seem refreshing rather than oppressive. Walking toward my car parked 2 blocks away, I was mentally organizing my presentation for the afternoon board meeting when I decided to take a shortcut through the construction zone on 3rd Avenue. The city had been working on underground utility repairs for 3 weeks, with orange cones and temporary metal plates covering the excavated areas. I had navigated this same route dozens of times, confident in my familiarity with the terrain. What I didn't anticipate was the delivery truck driver who had fallen asleep at the wheel after working a double shift. Thomas Hartwell, a 34-year-old, father of 2 from Beaverton, had been delivering restaurant supplies since 4 in the morning, trying to make extra money for his daughter's upcoming dance recital. According to the police report I would read weeks later, he never even applied the brakes before his 16-foot truck jumped the temporary barrier and struck me directly. The impact launched me 15 feet through the air before I landed against a concrete retaining wall. Witnesses later described the sound as horrifying. The metallic crash of the truck meeting the construction barrier followed immediately by what one bystander called the most sickening thud she had ever heard. My coffee cup shattered against the pavement, the oat milk latte spreading in a dark puddle that mixed with the morning rain and my blood. Emergency responders arrived within 4 minutes, an impressive response time that the paramedic team leader, Janet Rodriguez, credited with saving my life. She found me unconscious with what appeared to be severe head trauma, multiple broken ribs, a punctured lung, and internal bleeding that was immediately life-threatening. My purse had been thrown 20 feet in the opposite direction, its contents scattered across the construction site like confetti at a macabre celebration. Janet later told me that she almost called time of death twice during the 8-minute ambulance ride to Oregon Health and Science University Hospital. My pulse kept disappearing, only to flutter back just as she reached for the radio to inform the emergency room that they would be receiving a deceased patient instead of a critical one. She worked frantically to stabilize my breathing while her partner, David Kim, established IV access in my arm to combat the dangerous blood loss. The trauma team at OHSU, led by Dr. Rebecca Matsumoto, performed emergency surgery that lasted 7 hours. They had to relieve pressure on my brain by removing a portion of my skull, repair the damaged lung tissue, and stop internal bleeding from my spleen and liver. Dr. Matsumoto would later describe the procedure as one of the most challenging of her 15-year career, noting that my survival was touch and go for the first 48 hours. But I knew none of this as it happened. My consciousness had simply switched off like someone unplugging a television, leaving behind only the quiet darkness of coma while my body fought its private war for survival. My family's initial response seemed appropriately devastated when the hospital called. My mother, Linda Chen, a retired high school principal known for her unflappable demeanor during even the most challenging situations, reportedly broke down sobbing in the hospital waiting room. My father, Robert, a quiet man who worked as a software engineer for Intel, paced the corridors for hours, asking every medical professional he encountered for updates on my condition. My younger brother Kevin, 26 and fresh out of law school, drove up from Eugene where he was working at a small firm specializing in environmental law. He arrived at the hospital still wearing his court attire from an earlier hearing, his usually perfectly styled hair disheveled from running his hands through it during the 2-hour drive. My sister Monica, 2 years older than me and a pediatric nurse at a Sacramento hospital, took emergency leave from her position and flew to Portland the same evening. For the first week, they maintained a constant vigil by my bedside. Monica, with her medical training, asked detailed questions about my treatment plan and prognosis. She understood the significance of the machines surrounding my bed, the ventilator that breathed for me, the monitors tracking my brain activity, and the feeding tube that provided the nutrition my unconscious body required. She translated medical terminology for our parents, explaining why certain procedures were necessary and what various test results indicated about my recovery prospects. Kevin, ever the lawyer, focused on the practical matters that someone needed to handle. He contacted my employer to arrange medical leave, communicated with my insurance company about coverage for the extensive treatment, and began investigating the circumstances of the accident to determine if legal action might be necessary. His methodical approach to crisis management had always been his way of processing overwhelming emotions, channeling anxiety into productive action. My parents took turns reading to me from books they found in the hospital gift shop, playing music from my childhood, and maintaining the kind of conversation they hoped might somehow reach through the medical coma. Mom brought photo albums from home, sitting beside my bed and describing memories from family vacations, holiday celebrations, and milestone moments throughout my 31 years of life. Dad, typically a man of few words, surprised everyone by talking to me constantly during his shifts. He described his work projects, shared observations about the weather, and recounted stories from my childhood that none of us had discussed in years. Monica later told me that watching our normally reserved father hold my hand while describing the tomato plants in his backyard garden brought her to tears multiple times. During those first 7 days, the medical team remained cautiously optimistic about my eventual recovery. Dr. Matsumoto explained that while my injuries were severe, my age and overall health prior to the accident were significant advantages. The brain swelling was responding well to medication, my other organs were healing appropriately, and most importantly, the periodic brain scans showed activity patterns consistent with a healing mind rather than permanent damage. However, as the second week progressed without signs of consciousness returning, the atmosphere around my hospital bed began to shift subtly. The conversations between my family members and the medical staff took on a more serious tone, with increased discussion about long-term care options and potential outcomes that didn't include a full recovery. It was Dr. Harrison Walsh, the hospital's senior neurologist, who first introduced the possibility that my consciousness might never return to its previous state. A distinguished man in his early 60s with graying temples and the kind of bedside manner that combined professional competence with genuine compassion. Dr. Walsh had seen hundreds of traumatic brain injury cases throughout his career. His experience taught him to balance hope with realistic expectations, particularly when families were struggling to process their loved one's condition. During a family meeting on day 12 of my coma, Dr. Walsh carefully explained that while my brain showed healing activity, the specific areas affected by the trauma-controlled consciousness and cognitive function He used diagrams and simple language to help my family understand that I might recover physically while remaining in a persistent vegetative state, aware but unable to interact meaningfully with the world around me. The statistics he shared were sobering. Patients who remained unconscious for more than 2 weeks after traumatic brain injury had significantly reduced chances of returning to their previous level of function. While some individuals did wake up after longer periods, many faced permanent cognitive disabilities, personality changes, or remained in minimally conscious states that required constant care. Monica, with her medical background, asked the difficult questions that my parents couldn't bring themselves to voice. What would long-term care look like? How would we know if I was experiencing pain or discomfort? What quality of life could I expect if I did regain consciousness? Dr. Walsh answered each inquiry with careful honesty, acknowledging that many aspects of traumatic brain injury remained unpredictable. The financial implications of extended care began weighing heavily on the family discussions. My insurance coverage was comprehensive but not unlimited, and the costs of specialized neurological care, potential rehabilitation, and long-term medical support could easily exceed hundreds of thousands of dollars. Kevin researched various care facilities, visiting potential options and gathering information about costs, staffing ratios, and treatment approaches. My parents, both in their early 60s and looking toward retirement, faced the reality that caring for a daughter in a persistent vegetative state might require them to sell their home, liquidate retirement savings, and fundamentally restructure their lives around my medical needs. The emotional burden was compounded by financial stress that threatened to overwhelm the entire family structure. It was during the 3rd week of my coma that I first began to sense something changing in the conversations happening around my bed. Though I remained unconscious and unable to respond, some part of my mind had begun processing sounds and voices in a way that felt different from the complete absence of the earlier weeks. I couldn't move, couldn't open my eyes, couldn't signal my awareness in any way. But I was beginning to hear fragments of discussion that confused and frightened me. I remember the first clear sentence that penetrated through the fog of unconsciousness. My mother's voice, strained with exhaustion and grief, saying to someone just outside my room, "We need to start making decisions about her final arrangements." The words seemed to come from a great distance, as if I were hearing them through water, but their meaning struck me with unexpected clarity. Final arrangements. The phrase echoed in whatever portion of my mind remained active, trying to process what could possibly require final arrangements when I was clearly still alive, still breathing, still existing in whatever form this strange state represented. I attempted to move, to speak, to somehow indicate that I was present and aware, but my body remained completely unresponsive to my mental commands. Over the following days, similar fragments of conversation began filtering through my consciousness with increasing frequency and clarity. I heard Monica discussing funeral homes with Kevin, their voices clinical and practical as they compared services and pricing. I heard my father on the phone with someone, describing my condition as hopeless and asking about insurance coverage for burial expenses rather than continued medical care. The most devastating moment came when I heard my mother crying softly while talking to her sister, my Aunt Patricia, who had driven up from California to provide support. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "She's gone, Patty," my mother whispered, her voice breaking with anguish. "She's been gone for weeks. We're just prolonging the inevitable by keeping her on these machines. Sarah wouldn't want to live like this. She was always so independent, so full of life. This isn't living." My aunt's response was equally heartbreaking. "You're right, Linda. Sarah always said she never wanted to be kept alive artificially if something like this happened. Remember when we had that conversation after your mother's stroke? She was very clear about her wishes. Maybe it's time to honor what she would have wanted." I wanted to scream that I was still there, still fighting, still hoping to return to them. But my voice remained as silent as the rest of my body, trapped inside a form that appeared lifeless while my mind raced with desperate awareness. The conversation continued around me as if I were already deceased, as if the decision had already been made without any possibility of my input or recovery. Kevin, ever practical, began discussing the logistics of what he called transitioning Sarah's care. He spoke about advance directives, about my supposed wishes regarding life support, about the financial relief that would come from ending expensive medical interventions that seemed to be providing no benefit. His legal training had taught him to approach emotional situations with rational analysis, but hearing my own brother discuss my death as a practical matter felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical injury. The medical team, led by Dr. Walsh, had apparently begun supporting the family's inclination toward ending life support. During conversations I could partially hear, he explained that my brain activity, while present, showed no signs of the kind of consciousness that would allow for meaningful recovery. He used terms like minimal brain function and biological persistence without cognitive awareness to describe my condition. What neither Dr. Walsh nor my family realized was that my consciousness was slowly reassembling itself, like scattered puzzle pieces gradually finding their correct positions. I was aware but unable to demonstrate that awareness through any physical response that the medical equipment could detect. The machines monitoring my condition showed stable but minimal brain activity, not the complex patterns that would indicate conscious thought and awareness. I began to understand that my family had moved from hoping for my recovery to planning for my death. The conversations around my bed shifted from discussing potential rehabilitation facilities to comparing cremation versus burial options. Monica researched funeral directors while Kevin handled the legal aspects of discontinuing life support. My parents focused on memorial service planning, discussing which of my friends and colleagues should be notified about my impending death. The irony was devastating. I was more aware of their planning process than I had been of anything since the accident. I could hear them dividing my belongings, discussing who should receive various personal items that held significance in my life. I heard them debating whether to hold the service at the Methodist Church, where we had attended sporadically during my childhood, or at the environmental center where I had worked, which they felt better represented my adult values and commitments. My mother began writing my obituary, reading drafts aloud to Monica and asking for suggestions about how to capture the essence of my life in a few paragraphs. She struggled with the wording, trying to balance accuracy with the kind of inspiring tribute that would honor my memory. Listening to her describe my life in past tense while I lay there conscious but helpless was perhaps the cruelest aspect of this entire ordeal. The obituary described my passion for environmental conservation, my work with at-risk youth through volunteer programs, my love of hiking and outdoor photography, and my close relationships with family and friends. It mentioned my education at Portland State University, my career achievements at the Environmental Center, and my plans for the river restoration project that would now never be completed. Every word was accurate, but hearing my life summarized as a completed story when I still felt vibrantly alive inside was almost unbearable. They scheduled the memorial service for a Saturday morning, exactly 4 weeks after the accident. Timing would allow Kevin to handle the legal requirements for ending life support on Friday evening, with the service following the next day to provide immediate comfort and closure for family and friends. Monica arranged catering for the reception, while my parents selected music that had been meaningful during my childhood and young adulthood. The Methodist Church had a beautiful sanctuary with tall windows that overlooked a small garden where I had played as a child during lengthy services. My mother felt that setting would provide the kind of peaceful environment appropriate for celebrating my life while acknowledging the tragedy of my early death. She contacted the pastor, Reverend Elizabeth Murphy, who had known our family for 15 years and agreed to conduct the service. My father, despite his typically reserved nature, insisted on speaking during the service. He spent hours crafting, a eulogy that captured his memories of raising a daughter who was determined to make the world better through her environmental work. His tribute focused on my childhood curiosity about nature, my teenage environmental activism, and my adult career dedicated to conservation efforts. He practiced reading it aloud to my mother, his voice breaking with emotion at several points. Kevin planned to speak about my dedication to social justice and my volunteer work with organizations that supported underprivileged communities. He had researched my involvement with various causes, discovering projects and commitments that even he hadn't fully understood during my lifetime. His eulogy would emphasize my belief that individual action could create meaningful change in the world. Monica chose to focus her remarks on our sisterly relationship and my role as the family member who brought everyone together during holidays and celebrations. She planned to share stories about my terrible cooking attempts, my enthusiasm for organizing family game nights, and my habit of sending encouraging text messages whenever someone was facing a difficult situation. Friends from my workplace began, contributing to a memorial fund that would support the river restoration project I had been developing. My supervisor, Janet Martinez, coordinated with several environmental organizations to establish a scholarship in my name for students pursuing careers in conservation biology. The outpouring of support from colleagues and community members provided some comfort to my family while they processed their grief. My best friend since college, Rebecca Torres, flew in from Seattle to attend the service and speak about our friendship. She had been devastated when Monica called to inform her about the accident and my deteriorating condition. Rebecca spent hours going through photographs from our years of friendship, selecting images that captured my personality and our shared adventures hiking throughout the Pacific Northwest. The hospital social worker, Amanda Richardson, had guided my family through the difficult process of planning for the discontinuation of life support. She explained the timeline, the legal requirements, and what they could expect during my final hours. Her compassionate approach helped them understand that ending artificial life support was a loving decision that would allow me to die peacefully, rather than prolonging a situation that offered no hope for meaningful recovery. Dr. Walsh scheduled the removal of life support for Friday at 6 p.m, timing that would allow family members to be present while ensuring that the process occurred with appropriate medical supervision. He explained that some patients passed away within minutes of discontinuing artificial respiration, while others might survive for several hours or even days using whatever natural breathing capacity remained. My family prepared themselves emotionally for what they believed would be my final day of life. They planned to spend Friday at the hospital, sharing memories, playing my favorite music, and ensuring that my transition would be surrounded by love rather than the clinical atmosphere that had dominated the previous 4 weeks. Monica arranged for flowers from my favorite florist, while Kevin brought my laptop containing playlists I had created for different moods and occasions. My parents wrote letters they planned to read aloud during those final hours, expressing their love, their pride in my accomplishments, and their gratitude for the joy I had brought to their lives. These letters represented their attempts to say everything they wished they had expressed while I was conscious and able to respond. The anticipation of this final goodbye was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. What none of them realized was that my awareness had been steadily increasing throughout this planning period. I could hear their conversations with growing clarity, understand their preparations, and feel the overwhelming frustration of being unable to communicate my continued presence. I was trapped inside a body that appeared lifeless while my mind remained active and desperate to reconnect with the people I loved most. The night before my scheduled death, I experienced the most vivid consciousness I had known since the accident. I could hear every word spoken in my room, feel the warmth of hands holding mine, and sense the emotional atmosphere surrounding my bed. My family had gathered for what they believed would be their final evening with me, sharing stories and expressing their love while I lay there acutely aware but unable to respond. As Friday morning dawned, bringing the day they planned to end my life, I found myself fighting harder than ever to break through the physical barriers that kept me imprisoned inside my own body. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that this might be my last opportunity to demonstrate that I was still alive, still fighting, still hoping to return to the world and the people who meant everything to me. Friday arrived with the kind of overcast sky that Portland residents had grown accustomed to, but for my family, the weather seemed to mirror their somber mood as they prepared for what they believed would be my final day. I could sense the tension in the room before anyone even spoke, an electric atmosphere of grief and resolution that felt almost suffocating in its intensity. My consciousness had sharpened overnight to a degree that would have been miraculous if anyone had realized it was happening. Monica arrived first that morning, carrying a small duffel bag filled with items she thought might bring comfort during the day ahead. I heard her unzipping the bag and setting things on the nightstand beside my bed. She had brought my favorite, scented candle, the vanilla lavender one I kept in my apartment bathroom. Though hospital regulations prevented her from actually lighting it, she placed it near my head anyway, hoping the faint fragrance might somehow reach me in whatever state of existence I occupied. She also brought the small stuffed elephant I had kept on my bedroom dresser since college, a gift from Rebecca after our first hiking trip to Crater Lake. The elephant's name was Peanuts, a ridiculous choice that had seemed hilarious to my 22-year-old self, but now represented something precious about maintaining childlike joy in an increasingly serious adult world. Monica tucked Peanuts under my arm, positioning the soft gray fabric against my skin, where I could theoretically feel its presence. My parents arrived together an hour later, looking as though they had aged years in the past month. My mother carried a small photo album, the same one she had been bringing regularly, but today her hands shook as she opened it to familiar pages. My father held a thermos of coffee and what appeared to be a folder of papers, probably the legal documents. Kevin had prepared for the life support termination process. Kevin himself appeared around 10 in the morning, dressed in the kind of dark suit he wore for serious legal proceedings. His usually confident demeanor seemed subdued, and I noticed he avoided making direct eye contact with my face as he set his briefcase on the chair in the corner. The sound of him opening the case and shuffling through papers felt unnaturally loud in the quiet room where my family was gathering to end my life. Dr. Walsh arrived for his morning rounds with a gentleness that indicated he understood the gravity of the day ahead. His examination was thorough but brief, checking the same responses he had tested hundreds of times over the past month. He lifted my eyelids to shine a small flashlight directly into my pupils, testing for reactions that would indicate conscious awareness. I concentrated with every fiber of my being, trying to force some kind of response that would demonstrate my presence, but my eyes remained as unresponsive as they had been since the accident. He tested my reflexes by running a small metal instrument along the soles of my feet, pressing on my fingernails, and gently moving my arms and legs to assess muscle tone. Each test produced the same results that had been documented daily since my admission. My body showed no signs of voluntary movement, no responses that would suggest conscious control over my physical functions. The cruel irony was that I could feel every touch, every movement, every sensation with perfect clarity. When Dr. Walsh pressed the metal instrument against my foot, I felt the cool touch and the slight pressure exactly as I would have before the accident. When he moved my arm to test joint flexibility, I was acutely aware of the motion and wanted desperately to continue the movement myself, to show him that I was present and aware and fighting to return. Monica asked Dr. Walsh about my brain activity levels, a question she had posed regularly throughout my hospitalization. His answer remained consistent with previous reports. My brain showed minimal activity levels that were sufficient to maintain basic bodily functions, but insufficient to indicate the kind of conscious awareness that would make recovery possible. The EEG patterns suggested what he called persistent vegetative state, a condition where basic neurological functions continued without any meaningful cognitive activity. What Dr. Walsh couldn't detect with his current equipment was the storm of conscious thought occurring just beneath the threshold of measurable brain activity. I was thinking, processing, remembering, and experiencing emotions with an intensity that felt almost overwhelming. My mind raced constantly, analyzing every conversation I heard, every sound in the room, every touch on my skin. I was more mentally active than I had been during many periods of my healthy adult life. My family spent the morning sharing memories and talking to me in voices that carried the weight of final goodbyes. My mother read from the photo album, describing images from family vacations, birthday celebrations, and holiday gatherings that spanned my entire life. She lingered on pictures from my college graduation, my first apartment, and the day I received the job offer from the environmental center. Her voice cracked with emotion as she described how proud she and my father had been of my career accomplishments and my dedication to making the world better. My father, normally a man of few words, surprised everyone by talking almost continuously throughout the morning. He described memories from my childhood that I had forgotten, moments when my curiosity about nature and my determination to help others had been evident even at a young age. He told stories about teaching me to identify different species of trees during walks through Forest Park, about my insistence on rescuing injured birds and attempting to nurse them back to health in cardboard boxes in our garage. He talked about my teenage years when my environmental activism had sometimes embarrassed him and my mother, particularly when I organized protests against local businesses that weren't following sustainable practices. He admitted that he hadn't always understood my passion for causes that seemed abstract to him, but he had come to appreciate how my convictions shaped me into someone who genuinely cared about leaving the world better than she found it. Kevin contributed his own memories, focusing on our sibling relationship and the ways my personality had influenced his own development. He talked about how my confidence in pursuing unconventional goals had inspired him to choose environmental law rather than the more lucrative corporate career path his law school advisors had recommended. He described my encouragement during his most challenging periods in school and how my belief in his abilities had helped him persevere when he wanted to quit. These conversations were simultaneously comforting and torturous for me to hear. The love and appreciation my family expressed was everything I had ever wanted to know about how they truly felt about me and my life choices. But hearing these sentiments expressed as final tributes rather than ongoing encouragement was heartbreaking beyond description. I wanted to respond, to thank them for their support, to tell them how much their love had meant to me throughout my life. Around noon, Rebecca arrived from Seattle, bringing with her an energy that had always characterized our friendship. Even in this devastating situation, her presence seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room towards something that felt more like celebration than funeral preparation. She immediately began telling stories about our adventures together, describing hiking trips where my determination to reach difficult summits had pushed both of us beyond what we thought we could accomplish. Rebecca had brought a playlist of music we had listened to during our college years, songs that had soundtracked late-night study sessions, road trips to various national parks, and celebrations of academic and personal milestones. She connected her phone to a small portable speaker and played the music softly, creating an atmosphere that felt more like the memorial gathering it was intended to be, rather than the medical procedure that would precede it. The music triggered floods of memories that seemed to activate areas of my consciousness that had been dormant since the accident. I remembered dancing to these same songs in my college dorm room, singing along during long drives through the Cascade Mountains, and playing them during quiet evenings in my apartment when I needed comfort after difficult days at work. The familiar melodies seemed to strengthen whatever connections still existed between my awareness and my physical presence. Dr. Walsh returned in the early afternoon to discuss the timeline for the evening's procedure. He explained the process in clinical terms that were intended to prepare my family for what they would witness. He described how the removal of life support would occur gradually, with the ventilator settings reduced incrementally to allow my body time to adjust. If I possessed any capacity for independent breathing, this approach would give those functions the best opportunity to sustain life naturally. He estimated that the process would take approximately 2 hours from beginning to end, though he emphasized that every patient responded differently to the discontinuation of artificial support. Some individuals passed away within minutes, while others surprised families by continuing to breathe independently for hours or even days after the removal of life support equipment. The hospital chaplain, Reverend Sarah Williams, arrived to offer spiritual support during the transition process. She was a woman in her early 50s with a gentle demeanor and the kind of presence that seemed to bring peace to difficult situations. She spoke with my family about their beliefs regarding death and the afterlife, offering prayers and meditations that might provide comfort during the hours ahead. Reverend Williams also addressed me directly, speaking as if she believed I might be able to hear and understand her words. She talked about the love that surrounded me, the impact my life had made on others, and the peace that awaited me regardless of what happened next. Her words were intended to provide comfort, but they reinforced the assumption that my consciousness was absent and that death was inevitable. My mother had prepared letters that she wanted to read aloud before the life support removal began. She had written them during sleepless nights over the past week, trying to capture everything she wished she had said more often during my lifetime. Her letter expressed pride in my independence and accomplishments, gratitude for the joy I had brought to the family, and apologies for any times when she hadn't been as supportive as she should have been. She talked about memories from my childhood that had been especially meaningful to her, moments when my personality and character had been evident even at a young age. She described my compassion for animals and my determination to help anyone who seemed to be struggling. She mentioned my teenage rebellion phase with affection rather than frustration, acknowledging that my willingness to challenge authority had been preparation for my adult career advocating for environmental causes. My father's letter was shorter, but equally emotional. He expressed regret for not being more verbally affectionate throughout my life, acknowledging that his reserved personality had sometimes made it difficult for him to show how proud he was of my achievements. He talked about watching me grow from a curious child into a capable woman who was making a meaningful difference in the world. Kevin's letter focused on gratitude for my influence on his life and career choices. He credited me with inspiring his interest in environmental law and his commitment to using his legal education for social good, rather than personal financial gain. He promised to continue supporting the causes I had cared about, ensuring that my work would have lasting impact even after my death. Monica's letter was perhaps the most emotional, describing our relationship as sisters and friends. She talked about my role as a confidant during her nursing school years, my encouragement when she was considering specializing in pediatric care, and my support during difficult periods in her personal relationships. She promised to honor my memory by continuing to pursue work that helped vulnerable populations, particularly children who needed medical advocacy. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, additional visitors arrived to say their goodbyes. Janet Martinez, my supervisor from the Environmental Center, came with several colleagues who had worked closely with me on various projects. They shared stories about my dedication to the river restoration project and my innovative approaches to community engagement around environmental issues. They had established the memorial fund that would continue my work, and Janet presented my family with a small plaque recognizing my contributions to the organization's mission. The plaque would be mounted in the office I had occupied, serving as a permanent reminder of my commitment to environmental conservation. Several colleagues shared specific memories of projects we had worked on together, describing my attention to detail and my ability to maintain optimism even when facing significant bureaucratic obstacles. My former professor from Portland State University, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, arrived with condolences and memories from my undergraduate years. She remembered me as a student who asked thoughtful questions and approached environmental science with a combination of intellectual rigor and genuine passion for practical applications. She described how my senior research project on urban watershed restoration had been one of the most comprehensive undergraduate studies she had supervised in her 20-year teaching career. Friends from various periods of my life gathered throughout, The afternoon, creating an informal receiving line of people who wanted to express their appreciation for my friendship and support. College roommates, hiking companions, former volunteer colleagues, and neighbors from my apartment building all came to share memories and offer comfort to my family. Each visitor brought their own perspective on my life and personality, creating a collective portrait of someone who had maintained meaningful connections across many different contexts. The consistency of their memories was remarkable. Everyone described me as someone who listened carefully, offered encouragement during difficult times, and approached challenges with determination and optimism. Rebecca coordinated with Monica to create a memory book where visitors could write messages that would be saved for my family to read later. The book filled with stories, photographs, and expressions of gratitude that painted a picture of a life that had touched many people in positive ways. Reading these tributes would have been overwhelming under normal circumstances, but experiencing them as preparations for my funeral while I remained conscious and aware added layers of surreal anguish to an already devastating situation. As evening approached and the time for ending life support grew closer, my family requested private time with me before the medical procedure began. Dr. Walsh agreed to return at 6 o'clock to begin the process, giving us approximately an hour for final family moments without the presence of medical staff or outside visitors. The room felt different when it was just the 5 of us together. My parents, Kevin, Monica, and Rebecca, arranged chairs in a circle around my bed, creating an intimate space for the conversations they needed to have. The lighting was dimmed to create a more peaceful atmosphere, and the only sounds were the mechanical rhythms of the equipment that had been keeping me alive for the past month. My mother took my hand and began speaking directly to me, telling me that it was okay to let go, that they understood I had fought as hard as possible, and that they would be okay without me. She assured me that my work would continue through the Memorial Fund, and that my memory would be honored through the lives I had touched. Her voice was steady, but filled with the kind of love that made her words almost unbearable to hear. My father, struggling with emotions he rarely expressed openly, talked about his pride in my independence and accomplishments. He told me that he had always admired my courage in pursuing goals that seemed difficult or unconventional. He promised to take better care of his health so that he could enjoy more years with my mother, and he committed to being more emotionally expressive with the family members who remained. Kevin spoke about his plans to continue my environmental advocacy through his legal career, promising to take on pro bono cases that supported conservation causes. He described his intention to establish a scholarship fund at Portland State University for students pursuing environmental science degrees, ensuring that my passion for the field would inspire future generations of activists and researchers. Monica talked about incorporating my values into her nursing career, particularly her work with pediatric patients whose families faced overwhelming medical challenges. She promised to approach each family with the kind of compassion and practical support I had shown throughout my life when friends and community members needed assistance. Rebecca, my closest friend and the person who probably understood my personality most completely, spoke about the adventures we would never have together and the conversations we would never continue. She promised to complete some of the hiking goals we had set, visiting national parks and wilderness areas that had been on our shared bucket list. She planned to scatter some of my ashes when the time came, in places that had been meaningful during our friendship. As 6 o'clock approached, the emotional intensity in the room reached levels that seemed almost unbearable. My family was preparing to say goodbye to someone they loved deeply, someone they believed was already essentially gone, but whose physical presence they had been clinging to for the past month. The decision to end life support represented both an acknowledgement of medical reality and an act of love intended to spare me from indefinite existence in a state they considered undignified. Dr. Walsh knocked gently on the door at exactly 6 o'clock, accompanied by 2 nurses who would assist with the life support termination process. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere from intimate family gathering to medical procedure, though he maintained the respectful demeanor appropriate for such a significant moment. He explained the sequence of events that would occur over the next 2 hours. First, They would reduce the ventilator settings gradually, allowing my body to adjust to decreasing levels of artificial respiratory support. They would monitor my vital signs continuously, watching for any indication that I possessed independent breathing capacity. If my body could sustain breathing without mechanical assistance, the process would be extended to give natural functions time to stabilize. The feeding tube and IV medications would be discontinued simultaneously with the ventilator reduction, allowing my body to transition without artificial nutrition or pharmaceutical support. Pain medication would be maintained to ensure comfort during the process, though Dr. Walsh emphasized that patients in persistent vegetative states typically didn't experience physical discomfort during life support termination. My family members positioned themselves around my bed to maintain physical contact during the procedure. My mother held my right hand, while my father placed his hand on my arm. Monica stood at the foot of the bed where she could observe both, my face and the medical equipment, while Kevin and Rebecca flanked my left side. The first reduction in ventilator support occurred at 6:15, decreasing the mechanical breathing assistance by approximately 25%. Dr. Walsh watched the monitors carefully, looking for any sign that my body would compensate for the reduced artificial respiration. My oxygen saturation levels remained stable initially, though he cautioned that this could change as the process continued. What Dr. Walsh and my family couldn't see was the panic that flooded my consciousness as I realized what was happening. I could feel the change in my breathing support immediately, a sensation like someone gradually restricting my air supply while I remained powerless to indicate my distress. My mind raced with desperate attempts to signal my awareness, to somehow demonstrate that I was present and fighting to survive. I concentrated every fragment of mental energy on trying to move any part of my body, to produce any response that would alert the medical team to my consciousness. I focused on my fingers, trying to squeeze my mother's hand. I attempted to move my eyes, to blink, to create any facial expression that would indicate awareness. I tried to alter my breathing pattern in some way that would register on the monitoring equipment. Nothing worked. My body remained as unresponsive as it had been throughout the entire month of my hospitalization. The disconnect between my active consciousness and my physical capabilities felt like being trapped inside a prison, with walls I couldn't see or touch. I was fully present mentally while appearing completely absent physically. At 6:30, Dr. Walsh made the second reduction in ventilator support, bringing the mechanical assistance down to 50% of its original levels. My oxygen saturation began to decline slightly, though it remained within ranges that he considered normal for this stage of the process. He assured my family that any changes they observed were expected, and that I wasn't experiencing discomfort. The reduction in breathing support created a sensation that I can only describe as slowly drowning while remaining completely conscious. I could feel my body's oxygen levels decreasing, could sense the struggle that my respiratory system was experiencing as it attempted to function without adequate mechanical assistance. The panic was overwhelming, but I had no way to communicate my distress or to signal that the process should be stopped. My family began saying their final goodbyes during this stage, believing that my death was imminent and that their words might somehow reach whatever consciousness remained. Their voices seemed to come from increasingly far away as my oxygen levels continued to decline, though my mental awareness remained sharp and focused. My mother whispered prayers and expressions of love, telling me repeatedly that it was okay to let go, that I had fought long enough, and that peace was waiting for me. Her words were intended to provide comfort and permission to die peacefully, but they had the opposite effect on my trapped consciousness. I wanted to scream that I wasn't ready to let go, that I was still fighting, that I needed more time to find my way back to them. At 6:45, the third reduction brought ventilator support down to 25% of original levels. My oxygen saturation dropped more significantly, and my heart rate began to increase as my body responded to the decreased respiratory support. Dr. Walsh noted these changes as expected, physiological responses, indicators that my body was beginning the dying process. The sensation of suffocation became more intense with each reduction in mechanical support. I felt as though I were drowning in slow motion, my consciousness remaining crystal clear while my body struggled with decreasing oxygen levels. The contrast between my mental alertness and my physical deterioration created a form of torture that I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. Rebecca began reading poems that had been meaningful during our friendship, verses about nature and friendship, and the beauty of life that felt both appropriate and heartbreaking. Her voice provided a focus point for my consciousness, something to concentrate on other than the physical distress of gradual suffocation. Kevin talked about his plans to honor my memory through his legal career, describing specific cases he intended to pursue that would continue my environmental advocacy work. His practical approach to grief was consistent with his personality, finding comfort in concrete actions rather than abstract emotional expressions. Monica monitored my vital signs with her nursing expertise, noting changes in heart rate and oxygen levels that indicated my body's response to decreased life support. She provided quiet updates to my parents, helping them understand what the various measurements meant and what they could expect as the process continued. At 7 o'clock, Dr. Walsh prepared to make the final reduction in ventilator support, bringing mechanical assistance down to minimal levels that would essentially require my body to breathe independently. He warned my family that this stage often marked the transition to death for patients who lacked the capacity for independent respiratory function. As he reached for the ventilator controls to make this final adjustment, something extraordinary began happening inside my consciousness. The combination of decreased oxygen and the emotional intensity of my family's goodbyes seemed to activate neurological pathways that had been dormant since the accident. I felt a surge of energy and determination unlike anything I had experienced since regaining awareness. With every fragment of mental strength I possessed, I focused on the simple goal of taking one independent breath, not a dramatic gasp or obvious sign of consciousness, but just one breath that would demonstrate some capacity for life without mechanical support. I concentrated on the muscles involved in breathing, trying to remember how voluntary respiration felt and worked. The final ventilator reduction occurred at 7:05, leaving my body with minimal mechanical breathing assistance. My oxygen levels immediately began dropping more rapidly, and my heart rate increased significantly as my cardiovascular system responded to the respiratory crisis. Dr. Walsh watched the monitors carefully, prepared to observe what he expected would be my final minutes of life. What happened next would change everything my family thought they knew about my condition and transform their plans for my funeral into preparations for what they hoped would be my recovery. But in that moment, as my consciousness fought desperately against the physical failure of my body, none of us knew whether I would find the strength to bridge the gap between awareness and action that had kept me trapped for so long. The silence in the room was deafening after Dr. Walsh made the final adjustment to the ventilator. My family held their breath, watching the monitors that displayed my declining vital signs, waiting for what they believed would be my last moments of life. The mechanical rhythms that had provided a steady soundtrack to my existence for the past month became barely audible whispers, no longer sustaining the basic functions that kept me alive. My consciousness burned with an intensity I had never experienced, as if the proximity to death had somehow amplified every aspect of my awareness. The decreased oxygen to my brain should have dulled my thinking, but instead, it seemed to sharpen my focus to a razor's edge. Every sound in the room became amplified, every touch on my skin felt electric, and my desperation to communicate reached levels that bordered on agony. I could hear my mother's quiet sobbing, feel the trembling in her hand as she gripped mine, sense the weight of my father's palm resting on my forearm. Monica's professional breathing techniques couldn't mask the emotional strain in her voice as she whispered medical observations to Kevin. Rebecca stood frozen at my bedside, her usual animated energy subdued by the gravity of watching her best friend die. The monitors began registering more dramatic changes as my oxygen saturation dropped below critical levels. My heart rate spiked erratically as my cardiovascular system struggled to compensate for the failing respiratory function. Dr. Walsh noted these developments with clinical detachment, explaining to my family that the irregular patterns indicated my body's final attempts to sustain life without artificial support. But something else was happening that the medical equipment couldn't detect. Deep within my consciousness, a transformation was occurring that felt like electrical storms rebuilding damaged neural pathways. The combination of oxygen deprivation and extreme emotional distress seemed to be forcing my brain to find alternative routes for signals that had been blocked since the accident. I felt the sensation of voluntary muscle control flickering back to life like lights turning on in a house that had been dark for weeks. It started as tiny sparks of connection between my thoughts and my physical form, almost imperceptible attempts at movement that probably wouldn't register on any monitoring device. But for me, these microscopic responses felt like revolutionary breakthroughs after a month of complete disconnection. My first target was my right index finger, the one wrapped within my mother's grasp. I concentrated every fragment of mental energy on the simple goal of creating one small movement, one tiny flex that might be noticeable to someone paying close attention. The effort required was enormous, like trying to lift a massive weight using only mental determination, but I felt something responding deep within the muscle tissue. The movement, when it came, was so subtle that I wasn't certain it had actually occurred. A barely perceptible twitch, lasting less than a second, that could easily have been attributed to involuntary muscle spasms that sometimes occurred during the dying process. But I felt it happen with absolute certainty, felt the conscious intention translated into physical action for the first time since the accident. My mother didn't notice the tiny movement. Her attention focused on my face rather than our joined hands. The monitors showed no change in my neurological status, no indication that voluntary motor function had returned. Dr. Walsh continued his clinical observations, noting the expected progression toward respiratory failure that would result in cardiac arrest within the next few minutes. I tried again, this time attempting to create a more sustained movement that would be impossible to dismiss as involuntary reflex. The effort felt like trying to move mountains with my mind, requiring levels of concentration I had never accessed before. But slowly, gradually, I felt my finger responding to my conscious commands, moving with deliberate intention rather than random muscle contractions. This time, my mother felt the movement immediately. Her quiet sobbing stopped abruptly as she looked down at our hands, uncertain whether she had imagined the subtle pressure against her palm. She watched my finger intently, hoping for another sign while afraid to voice her observation in case it was merely wishful thinking during her grief. I managed a third movement, slightly stronger and more sustained than the previous attempts. My finger curled against my mother's hand with unmistakable intentionality, creating pressure that couldn't be attributed to dying reflexes or random muscle activity. The movement was small but deliberate, a conscious communication after weeks of silence. My mother gasped audibly, causing everyone in the room to turn their attention toward her. She stared at our joined hands with an expression of shocked disbelief, her voice catching as she tried to explain what she thought she had felt. The words came out in a breathless rush of hope and terror, afraid that speaking might make the moment disappear like a cruel hallucination. Dr. Walsh immediately moved to examine my hand, testing for voluntary responses that would indicate returning consciousness. He pressed his fingers against my palm and requested that I squeeze if I could hear him, though his tone suggested he expected no response. The clinical skepticism in his voice was understandable, given my month-long absence of any voluntary activity. I summoned every reserve of mental strength to squeeze his fingers, creating sustained pressure that would be impossible to dismiss as involuntary reflex. The effort was exhausting, like running a marathon using only mental energy, but I managed to maintain the grip for several seconds before releasing it deliberately rather than letting it fade naturally. The change in Dr. Walsh's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His professional composure cracked as he realized the implications. a voluntary motor response returning after weeks of complete absence. He called for additional neurological testing equipment while continuing to assess my responses to various commands and stimuli. Monica, with her medical training, understood the significance of what was happening before my parents could fully process it. She began talking to me directly, asking simple questions that required yes or no responses that I could communicate through finger movements. Could I hear her voice? One squeeze for yes. Could I understand what she was saying? Another affirmative squeeze that sent shockwaves through my family. The room exploded into controlled chaos as Dr. Walsh called for immediate neurological consultation, while my family struggled to comprehend that I had been conscious and aware throughout the entire month of my hospitalization. The revelation that I had heard their conversations about funeral planning, their discussions about ending my life support, their expressions of love, meant as final goodbyes, created a mixture of joy and horror that was almost overwhelming to witness. Kevin immediately demanded explanations about how consciousness could return so suddenly after weeks of apparent vegetative state. His legal training kicked in as he began asking detailed questions about medical protocols, testing procedures, and the possibility that my awareness had been present but undetected throughout my hospitalization. Rebecca, ever practical despite her emotional shock, began testing my responses to personal questions that only I would know the answers to. She asked about shared memories, inside jokes from our friendship, and details about my life that would confirm my identity and mental capacity. Each correct response, communicated through deliberate finger movements, provided more evidence that my consciousness had returned intact. My father, typically reserved in emotional situations, broke down completely as the reality of my awareness became undeniable. He had been preparing to lose his daughter forever, to live with the regret of words left unspoken and love inadequately expressed. The sudden possibility of recovery, of second chances and continued relationship, overwhelmed his carefully maintained composure. Dr. Walsh worked frantically to reverse the life support reduction while calling for emergency neurological assessment. The irony was devastating. They had been systematically removing the artificial support keeping me alive at the exact moment when my consciousness was fighting its way back to the surface. If my awareness had returned even minutes later, I might have died before anyone realized I was present and fighting to survive. The respiratory support was gradually increased back to therapeutic levels, though Dr. Walsh explained that the damage from oxygen deprivation during the termination process might have long-term consequences. My brain had been functioning on critically low oxygen levels during the period when consciousness returned, potentially affecting cognitive abilities or creating permanent neurological deficits. Additional medical staff began arriving to assess my condition and determine the extent of my neurological recovery. The overnight transformation from dying patient to conscious survivor required immediate reevaluation of my diagnosis, treatment, plan, and prognosis. The medical team struggled to understand how someone in persistent vegetative state could regain awareness so suddenly and dramatically. My ability to communicate remained limited to simple finger movements, but even this basic interaction felt miraculous after a month of complete silence. I could answer yes and no questions, indicate comfort or discomfort, and provide responses that demonstrated intact memory and reasoning abilities. The communication was slow and exhausting, but it represented a bridge back to the world I had been separated from since the accident. My family began the overwhelming process of adjusting their expectations from funeral planning to recovery preparation. The memorial service scheduled for the following morning would need to be canceled or transformed into a celebration of my unexpected return to consciousness. The emotional whiplash of transitioning from grief to hope created a surreal atmosphere that none of us knew how to navigate. Monica took charge of practical matters, contacting relatives and friends who had been notified about my expected death to inform them about the dramatic change in my condition. The calls were awkward and emotional, trying to explain the inexplicable return of consciousness without understanding the medical implications or long-term prognosis. Kevin focused on legal and insurance matters, ensuring that the termination of life support was properly documented and that my continued care would be covered under my medical insurance. He also began researching patient rights and medical advocacy resources, determined to prevent any future situations where my care decisions might be made without adequate consideration of potential recovery. My father spent the evening holding my hand and talking to me constantly, making up for the emotional distance he had maintained throughout my adult life. He shared feelings and memories he had never expressed openly, taking advantage of this unexpected opportunity to communicate love and pride that he had struggled to voice under normal circumstances. Rebecca coordinated with my workplace to inform colleagues about my changed condition and to discuss potential modifications to the memorial fund they had established. The Environmental Center had already begun planning projects in my honor, activities that would now need to be reconsidered as I hopefully prepared to return to active involvement in my work. Dr. Walsh arranged for comprehensive neurological testing to assess the extent of my cognitive recovery and to determine what therapeutic interventions might support continued improvement. He explained that consciousness returning after such a prolonged absence was extremely rare, and that my case would likely be studied by neurological researchers trying to understand the mechanisms of recovery from traumatic brain injury. The night passed in a blur of medical assessments, family conversations, and gradual expansion of my communication abilities. I progressed from simple finger squeezes to slight head movements, then to basic facial expressions that conveyed emotion and response. Each small improvement felt monumental after the complete physical disconnection I had experienced since the accident. My family struggled with complex emotions as they processed the revelation that I had been aware throughout the month of my hospitalization. The knowledge that I had heard their discussions about my condition, their plans for my funeral, and their expressions of grief created a mixture of embarrassment and guilt that was difficult to address directly. I wanted to reassure them that I understood their decisions had been made with love and based on medical advice that suggested no hope for recovery. But my limited communication abilities made it difficult to express complex thoughts and emotions. Simple finger squeezes could convey basic responses, but couldn't communicate the forgiveness and understanding I felt toward their choices. The medical team worked throughout the night to stabilize my condition and assess the full extent of my neurological recovery. They discovered that while my consciousness had returned dramatically, my physical abilities remained significantly compromised. I could move my fingers and show facial expressions, but larger motor functions like speaking, sitting up, or controlling my arms and legs remained beyond my current capabilities. Dr. Walsh explained that recovery from traumatic brain injury often occurred in stages, with different neurological functions returning at varying rates over extended periods. My sudden return to consciousness was encouraging, but it didn't guarantee that other abilities would recover quickly or completely. The rehabilitation process would likely take months or years, with uncertain outcomes for my eventual level of independence. The revelation about my awareness during the coma period raised difficult questions about medical ethics and patient care protocols. If consciousness could be present without detectable neurological indicators, how many other patients might be aware but unable to communicate their presence? My case would likely influence future approaches to coma assessment and life support. Decision-making. My family began making practical arrangements for my continued care and hopefully eventual rehabilitation. The transition from preparing for my death to planning for my recovery required completely different resources and considerations. They investigated rehabilitation facilities, adaptive equipment for communication, and therapeutic programs that might support my neurological healing. As dawn approached, bringing the day that had been scheduled for my memorial service, my family gathered around my bed to discuss how to proceed with their changed circumstances. The church had been reserved, flowers ordered, and friends notified about the service that would now need to be dramatically restructured or canceled entirely. Monica suggested transforming the planned memorial into a celebration of my unexpected recovery, using the gathering to share the miraculous news with friends and extended family who had been prepared to say their final goodbyes. The idea appealed to my parents, who wanted to honor the support they had received while sharing the joy of my return to consciousness. Kevin worried about the practical implications of such a sudden change, concerned about managing expectations when my recovery remained uncertain and potentially limited. He preferred a more cautious approach that acknowledged my improved condition without creating unrealistic hopes about my eventual level of function. Rebecca advocated for including me in the decision-making process, despite my limited communication abilities. She developed a series of yes and no questions that allowed me to express preferences about how to handle the situation. Her insistence on treating me as an active participant rather than a passive patient helped establish the foundation for my eventual return to independence. The morning brought additional medical consultations and continued neurological testing to assess my cognitive abilities and plan for therapeutic interventions. Speech therapists began working with me to evaluate my potential for verbal communication, while occupational therapists assessed my fine motor control and cognitive processing speed. My progress continued throughout the day, with gradual improvements in my ability to respond to complex questions and follow multi-step instructions. The medical team remained cautiously optimistic about my recovery potential, while emphasizing that the full extent of my neurological healing might take months or years to determine. The experience had fundamentally changed my perspective on life, consciousness, and the relationships that matter most. Being trapped inside my own body while fully aware had taught me about the fragility of human connection and the importance of expressing love and appreciation while we have the opportunity. I was determined to use my second chance to live more intentionally and to rebuild relationships with deeper honesty and emotional courage. My family's experience had been equally transformative, forcing them to confront their assumptions about consciousness, medical decision-making, and the ways we communicate love and support during crisis situations. The knowledge that I had been aware during their most private conversations about my condition had created a new level of intimacy and honesty in our relationships that might never have developed under normal circumstances. As I lay in my hospital bed, gradually regaining control over my physical responses and slowly rebuilding my connection to the world around me, I realized that my accident and recovery had given me something precious beyond the obvious gift of continued life. I had experienced unconditional love from my family and friends, witnessed their genuine grief at the thought of losing me, and gained absolute certainty about my value in their lives. The funeral they had planned would never happen, but the memorial they had prepared in their hearts would remain as a testament to the impact one life can have on others. My unexpected recovery was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward independence and full engagement with the world I had nearly lost forever. 6 months after that terrifying night when I nearly died during my own life support termination, I stood in the Environmental Center's conference room, addressing a packed audience about river restoration techniques. My voice was stronger now, though I still spoke more slowly than before the accident, choosing each word carefully to ensure clarity. The mild tremor in my left hand had mostly disappeared, and my balance had improved enough that I could walk without assistance for short distances. The recovery process had been grueling beyond anything I could have imagined. Those first weeks, after regaining consciousness, were filled with basic relearning exercises that would have seemed impossibly simple before my accident. Learning to swallow properly took 2 weeks of working with speech therapists. Forming coherent sentences required another month of intensive practice. Simple tasks like brushing my teeth or combing my hair demanded concentration and effort that exhausted me completely. Physical therapy sessions consumed 4 hours of every day, working with specialists who helped me rebuild strength and coordination in muscles that had atrophied during my month-long coma. My right side recovered more quickly than my left, creating an imbalance that required specific exercises to correct. Walking more than a few steps initially left me breathless and shaking, my cardiovascular system having been severely compromised by the extended period of inactivity. Cognitive rehabilitation proved equally challenging. While my memories remained intact and my reasoning abilities had returned, my processing speed was significantly slower than before the accident. Reading comprehension that used to be effortless now required intense focus and frequent breaks. Mathematical calculations that had been automatic became laborious mental exercises that demanded careful attention to avoid errors. My family's adjustment to my recovery was complicated by their guilt about the funeral planning and their relief that I had survived. Monica threw herself into researching brain injury rehabilitation, becoming my unofficial medical advocate and ensuring I received the most effective therapeutic interventions available. Her nursing background proved invaluable in navigating the complex medical system and communicating with various specialists involved in my care. Kevin used his legal skills to investigate the circumstances surrounding my accident, ultimately securing a settlement from the trucking company whose driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. The financial compensation provided security during my extended recovery period and helped cover therapeutic services that weren't fully covered by insurance. His methodical approach to the legal process gave him a constructive way to channel his protective instincts and support my healing. My father surprised everyone by becoming my most consistent companion during therapy sessions. His engineering background helped him understand the technical aspects of my rehabilitation equipment, and his patient personality proved perfect for the repetitive exercises required for neurological recovery. He attended every medical appointment, took detailed notes, and asked thoughtful questions that helped optimize my treatment plan. My mother struggled most with processing the revelation that I had been conscious during their funeral preparations. She couldn't forgive herself for the conversations I had overheard about ending my life support, despite my repeated assurances that I understood their decisions had been made with love and based on medical advice, suggesting no hope for recovery. Her guilt manifested as overprotective behavior that sometimes hindered my independence efforts. The relationship dynamics within our family had shifted dramatically as a result of the shared trauma. We communicated more openly about emotions and concerns, having learned that life was too fragile to waste on superficial interactions. My near-death experience had given us all permission to express love and appreciation more freely, creating deeper connections than we had maintained before the accident. Rebecca visited from Seattle every few weeks, bringing hiking gear and trail guides for future adventures we planned once my physical recovery progressed further. She adapted our friendship to accommodate my slower processing speed and physical limitations, finding new ways to maintain the active partnership that had always characterized our relationship. Her optimism about my eventual full recovery provided motivation during the most discouraging periods of rehabilitation. My return to work began with 2 hours per day, 3 days per week, focusing on tasks that didn't require extensive physical activity or rapid decision-making. Janet Martinez had held my position open, restructuring my responsibilities to match my current capabilities while allowing room for growth as my abilities improved. The river restoration project had progressed during my absence, but my unique perspective and expertise were still valuable to the ongoing efforts. The Environmental Center staff had created a modified workspace that accommodated my physical limitations while providing the technological support I needed for communication and documentation tasks. Adaptive equipment helped compensate for my reduced fine motor control, and flexible scheduling allowed me to work around therapy appointments and medical consultations. My colleagues treated me with a mixture of respect and careful consideration, recognizing that I was the same person with the same knowledge and passion, but acknowledging that my accident had changed some of my capabilities. Their acceptance of my modified abilities without patronizing behavior helped me maintain confidence in my professional identity during the challenging recovery process. Public speaking, once effortless for me, now required extensive preparation and practice. I had to write out my presentations completely, rather than relying on bullet points and improvisation. My delivery was slower and more deliberate, but colleagues noted that my communication had become more thoughtful and impactful as a result of the extra consideration I gave to each word and concept. The experience of being trapped in my own body had given me profound empathy for individuals facing various types of physical and cognitive challenges. I began incorporating disability rights perspectives into my environmental advocacy work, recognizing that accessibility and inclusion were essential components of sustainable community development. My brush with death had also intensified my urgency about environmental issues. Having faced the fragility of individual existence, I felt compelled to work more aggressively on problems that threatened collective survival. My advocacy became more passionate and focused, driven by the knowledge that time was precious and shouldn't be wasted on incremental approaches to critical issues. The neurological specialists monitoring my recovery remained amazed by the extent of my improvement. Dr. Walsh admitted that my case had changed his approach to coma assessment and influenced his recommendations about life support decisions for other patients. My dramatic recovery after apparent persistent vegetative state had contributed to medical literature about consciousness and brain injury rehabilitation. Research institutions had requested permission to study my case and include my experience in training materials for neurological residents and rehabilitation specialists. I agreed to participate in these educational efforts, hoping that my story might help other families facing similar medical crises make more informed decisions about care and recovery potential. The psychological impact of my experience extended beyond the obvious trauma of the accident itself. I had lived through the unique horror of being conscious but unable to communicate while my family planned my funeral. Processing this experience required specialized counseling with therapists who understood both brain injury recovery and the complex family dynamics created by medical crises. I struggled with nightmares about suffocation and being trapped, echoes of the terrifying hours when my life support was being gradually terminated while I remained aware but helpless. These psychological symptoms improved gradually with therapy, but they served as constant reminders of how close I had come to death and how precious my recovered abilities truly were. The knowledge that I had heard every conversation about my condition, every expression of love meant as final goodbye, every practical discussion about funeral arrangements had created an unusual intimacy between my family members and me. We had shared experiences that were typically private to grieving families, creating both awkwardness and deeper understanding of our relationships. My perspective on mortality had been fundamentally altered by experiencing the preparation for my own death while remaining conscious and aware. I had witnessed genuine grief from people who loved me, heard authentic expressions of appreciation for my life and character, and gained certainty about my impact on others that most people never receive during their lifetimes. This knowledge had eliminated much of the anxiety and uncertainty that had previously characterized my approach to relationships and career decisions. Having heard unfiltered expressions of love and respect from family and friends, I no longer questioned my worth or worried about whether my life had meaning and value. My daily routines now included gratitude practices that would have seemed excessive before my accident. Simple activities like brewing morning coffee, feeling raindrops on my skin, or having conversations with friends carried intense appreciation that transformed ordinary experiences into sources of joy and wonder. The progressive improvement in my physical and cognitive abilities continued throughout the first year of recovery, though the pace of change slowed significantly after the initial dramatic gains. I had regained approximately 80% of my pre-accident functioning, with continued gradual improvement expected over the following years. My relationship with medical professionals had evolved from passive patient to active advocate for brain injury awareness and research. I participated in fundraising events for neurological research, shared my story at medical conferences, and worked with patient advocacy organizations to improve care protocols for individuals with traumatic brain injuries. The trucking company settlement had provided financial security that allowed me to be selective about work commitments and focus on projects that aligned with my values and recovery goals. I no longer felt pressured to accept every professional opportunity, instead choosing assignments that would be meaningful and sustainable given my current capabilities. My friendship with Rebecca had deepened through her unwavering support during my recovery process. She had visited regularly, adapted her communication style to accommodate my processing changes, and maintained optimism about our future adventures together. Her loyalty during my most vulnerable period had strengthened our bond beyond what either of us had expected. The environmental center had benefited from my renewed focus and intensified passion for conservation work. My recovery had made me more efficient and purposeful in my professional activities, eliminating time wasted on projects that weren't aligned with my core mission of environmental protection and community engagement. As I concluded my presentation to the conference audience, sharing data about successful river restoration techniques and community involvement strategies, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The accident that nearly killed me had ultimately given me a deeper appreciation for life, stronger family relationships, and renewed purpose in my professional work. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and several attendees approached afterward with questions about implementation strategies and funding approaches for similar projects in their communities. These conversations energized me in ways that reminded me why I had chosen environmental work as my career focus, confirming that my recovery had preserved not just my life, but my passion for making meaningful contributions to the world. That evening, as I sat in my apartment overlooking the city lights of Portland, I thought about the memorial service that had been planned for the morning after my dramatic recovery. The flowers that had been ordered for my funeral were eventually delivered to the hospital, where they brightened my room during the early weeks of rehabilitation. The church reservation had been converted to a celebration of Thanksgiving, attended by family and friends who wanted to witness my recovery and express their gratitude for the miracle they had experienced. My story had become a source of hope for other families facing similar medical crises, though I was careful to emphasize that my outcome was unusual and shouldn't create unrealistic expectations for others dealing with traumatic brain injuries. Each case was unique, and recovery patterns varied dramatically between individuals with similar initial conditions. The experience had taught me that consciousness and awareness existed in forms that current medical technology couldn't always detect or measure. My month of silent observation while appearing comatose had given me insights into the complexity of human consciousness that would influence my advocacy for improved medical assessment techniques and patient care protocols. As I prepared for sleep in my own bed, surrounded by familiar belongings and the comfort of independent living, I felt overwhelming gratitude for the second chance I had been given. The funeral that had been planned in my honor would never occur, but the love and appreciation it represented would continue to motivate my efforts to live purposefully and contribute meaningfully to the lives of others and the health of our shared environment. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to advance the river restoration project, to mentor young environmentalists, and to enjoy simple pleasures like morning coffee and conversations with friends. These ordinary experiences carried extraordinary meaning for someone who had nearly lost the chance to participate in life's daily miracles. My recovery continued, my relationships had deepened, and my purpose had intensified. The accident that should have ended my story had instead transformed it into something richer and more meaningful than I could have imagined. I had been given the rare gift of hearing my own eulogy while still alive to appreciate it, and I was determined to spend every remaining day proving worthy of the love and respect that had been expressed during my darkest hours. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.